So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this series, this fifth series of the video cast, which is around building resilience in the pandemic. And today, what we're going to talk about is very much around racism, and the pandemic. And I think it's a very important subject. The death of Floyd in May 2020, I Can't Breathe, came as a big theme. And today we have, and it's a theme that connects everything. And today we have some key people here with us today, like Pastor Vincent Cox, who is the senior pastor at the New Testament Church of God in Luton. He's also a member of Churches Together in Luton executive and the Better Together Network, a consortium of leaders from local Black churches, community groups, and business organizations in Luton. He's also been working in the Interdenominational Commission on Racial Justice with Churches Together in Luton. We also have Rehana Faisal, who's currently doing her master's in culture and an MA in culture, diaspora, and ethnicity at Birkbeck University in London. She's heavily involved in faith and volunteer sector, large part of the Luton network of mosques, very passionate about the idea of ethnic minorities and racism, and also she has included scrutinizing the unequal opportunities and outcomes which cut across sectors from education and criminal justice. And last but not least, we have Jeremy Williams. Jeremy Williams is a writer and blogger and a campaigner. He's also from Stopsley Baptist Church, and he co-authored a book called The Economics of Arrival, the writer of Earthbound Report, the leading green blog in the UK. He's a freelance writer for RSPB, Oxfam, TFN, and a variety of organizations and campaigns and small businesses. As a campaigner, he's involved in a lot of environmental actions, but also, interestingly now, Jeremy also is publishing a new book called Climate Change is Racist, which I find very interesting. It's about race, privilege, and the struggle for climate change. So we have a panel of heavyweight in Luton today with us, especially in this field of discrimination and racism. So if I may ask perhaps this first question, since we are talking about racism and resilience, I think the first question to ask is, what is resilience? What does resilience mean for you? And if I may start with Rehana.
So I think for me, resilience is intrinsically linked to my faith and the way that I live my faith. And I think that, resilience is about getting up every day and working through every day and just trusting in God, and trusting and trying to aim to do the right thing every day. And I think, the last year has been a really tough one for anybody who talks about race. And I think more so if you're a racialized person, because we've sort of had this constant onslaught of denial about both our experiences, alongside this sort of global pandemic where, in Luton, within our Muslim community, we have just seen the sort of most catastrophic, I think, implications of that pandemic. We've had huge loss of life, but also just huge loss in multiple ways. And the only way that we can account for that, although many would try and argue otherwise, it is racism. And I think the only way that you can get through that kind of pain, that kind of loss, certainly for me, is by holding on to that trust in God, holding on to the to that sort of thought that there is something positive that comes from this. And this is the only thing we can do. That we might not, this might not change in my lifetime. It might not change at all. But the only thing that we can do is strive to do and say through our words and action the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Rehana. So if I come to Jeremy, so what is resilience for you, Jeremy?
Well, I think resilience is about the ability to take what life throws at us and to withstand it and not to be overwhelmed by it. And resilience is a strange thing because you don't really think about it until you need it. And then suddenly you realize whether you have it or not. And it's something that's hard to build when there's no obvious threat. The other thing about resilience is it's not about something that you have, but it's something that your community has. And that means that the more fractured and divided community is, when more people are pitted against each other, the harder it is to build community, because when hard times come, you get blame and you get further division. And so as a Christian, one of the things that I always want to emphasize is unity and common purpose and shared humanity and the value of all people. And that so that when hard times come, you really can pull together as a community rather than divide and blame each other. So resilience for me is very much about community and who we are together, as well as our own kind of personal strengths and beliefs and how those become part of the community.
I really like that resilience is very much about community. It's something that we've lost very often. We talk sometimes very often about personal resilience, but we forget about this communal aspect, very much part of resilience. If I come to Pastor Vincent Cox, Pastor, what is resilience for you and how you see resilience, especially from men of faith?
I was reflecting as the other two speakers were giving their answer, and the word that keeps coming to me is the ability to bounce back, the ability to be strong, to survive, to thrive. And as a man of faith, that comes to me through my faith in God, through my trust in God. The scripture said, though he slays me, yet I trust him. And it's that ability that even though everything seems to be going against you, you're able to pull through. And as Jeremy said, it's not just an individual thing, it is a communal thing. And what comes to mind as a Black man, what comes to mind, and something I've shared before, is at the abolition of slavery in the UK, unlike in the Bible, when the nation of Israel left Egypt, they left with resources. When Nehemiah went to build the wall, the king gave him resources to build a wall. But at the abolition of slavery in this country, it was the former slave owners who got resources, and the former slaves were actually had to contribute to this country's economy and keep it going for free. They were told it was an apprenticeship. And I say to Black people, look, you don't realize how strong we are. We are a people who were oppressed. We are a people that when we were freed without resource, and yet we thrive. And for me, that's significant resilience. And a lot of that was based on faith in God. People had just utmost trust that God would take them through.
Beautiful, and I can really totally relate to that, Pastor Vincent, because I'm originally from Mauritius, and when the abolition of slavery happened, and when the slaves were liberated, as you said, they had no resources. And actually, today the bank, what we call the Mauritius Commercial Bank, actually its logo is a boat where the slaves were taken to Mauritius. That's the logo of that, and they become even more richer than they used, and they still, I would say, control the economy. So that's one of the areas, and the Black people were left complete. Even today, that impact of slavery is still heavy in the psyche of these people. So, talking about racism and resilience, very often, and I'm quite curious about this concept of when somebody bring the idea of or the question or questioning the system about racism, very often they've been put in one corner or being told that actually stop bringing the race card. Why are you playing the race card? And at some point we say you have to be resilient. And we hear that also, for example, in schools. And recently, actually, yesterday, The Guardian published an article in one of the schools in London, in one of those academies, where actually young people, despite this pandemic, are protesting against some of the policies of that school about, for example, the hairstyle of some of the young people, or the hijab that some of the communities are wearing. I think it was something to do with color. The other one was to do with the Afro hair, which is actually affecting the visibility of people. There's all of that, and young people are taking and moving this debate forward, despite, we've seen in Luton, actually, people were actually criticized by bringing the Black Lives Matter despite the lockdown, and they went on the street. So there's something in people that is driving them, despite this pandemic, that they need to stand up for this. Why? What is driving people? Why are people coming forward and saying that, Black Lives Matter, racism is not on? What is this pandemic causing at this moment that is really pushing people to talk about racism and to come on the street despite no matter what? If I can come to Jeremy.
I'm aware that I speak as a white person, and as I've been researching this book on climate change and race, the thing that's become really striking to me is how easy it is for white people to think that it doesn't affect them. And as soon as we start talking about resilience, the thing that struck me most was the burden that racism is. And so I had this strange experience when I finished the book. I'd found it really hard. I'd found it mentally difficult and emotionally difficult. And when I reached the end of the book and kind of typed the last word, I thought, that's a relief. I can put this down and I can think about something else. And then I realized for people of color, they can't put this down. They can't ever walk away from it. It's always there. And the challenge that was to me, because even though I'd just written the book about race, realizing that for me, I was stepping into something and I had the freedom to step out again, and the privilege that represented. And so what I've become very aware of is how when people take to the streets, even in a pandemic, it's because they can't put this down. It's because I have the privilege of saying, well, why can't you wait until the pandemic is over? But for people of color, this is live, it's every day, and you can never take a holiday from it. You can never stop. And so for me, that's the thing that I've really learned, perhaps, is just how deep privilege runs. And it's never for people like me to say, this isn't urgent, now is not the time.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And you talk about privilege, and I know, Rehana, you've been very much at the forefront of raising, you've been a voice in Luton, addressing these issues around structural racism. And why was it important? You were very much part of this Black Lives Matter, supporting the Black community, despite it was Black Lives Matter. You come from an Asian background, a Muslim, Pakistani background. You were there, you supported this. Why was it so important, despite the lockdown? You were all in the middle of town hall and trying to address this issue and bringing your voice forward.
Look, I often hear that comment about playing the race card. I visibly see people roll their eyeballs if I talk about racism or its impact. That's kind of part and parcel of our kind of daily experience when we talk about it. But we persevere, right? And seeing those young people yesterday in Pimlico, a little bit of joy to me, because I thought, well, actually, regardless of how much you deny this experience for us, those of us who feel it, who know it, who live it, we know it's there, and your denial really does nothing to that. And that, to me, is a representation of how profoundly resilient we are and how we become. And Jeremy talked there previously about community, and the reason why I was at Black Lives Matter, the reason why I wanted to support the young people who put that protest together, who wanted to talk about their experiences, is because of community. And although clearly I'm not Black, there is a shared experience among us. Racism will present itself differently to me than it will do to Vincent. So our lived experiences of that will be different because we are racialized differently. But there is also a solidarity there. There is also a shared experience there that that we stand together on, that we can talk. I was just reflecting again yesterday with my daughter. So how do you do this every day whilst everyone is telling you otherwise, and how do you it can be easy to, I think, come to a point perhaps where you're thinking, actually, maybe I'm wrong. But actually, over time, I've just come to a point to say, thank God I can see this injustice. You know, that's something for me to be really grateful to God about, that I can see this injustice and that I am somehow every day being able to find the resources to be able to speak against it. And you know, within my faith, within Islamic scripture, there's lots of emphasis on, and there is that the hadith, the saying of the Prophet, where he talks about those who stand for justice, who uphold justice, being being close to God. And I think there's I'm trying to remember the exact words, upon pulpits of light. Isn't that just a lovely image? So, you know, we can be told that this is not true, but, you know, thank goodness we can see it. Thank goodness we can see that injustice, and thank goodness we can find ways, and we continue to find ways of talking about it. And ultimately that's for God, and our reward is with God.
Thank you very much, Rehana. And I like the way you say that, thank God we can see this injustice. And if I come to Pastor Vincent, as a Black person, and we had this Black Lives Matter, very much led by a number of activists in Luton, and including a number of young people. So for you, why was it important, despite the pandemic, despite people saying, well, we are in a lockdown, and yet it was important to come on the street and to make your voice heard?
It was really a profound moment. And I took my 17-year-old son into the town centre, and we stood with protesters. And I said to him, it's really important that we do this. It's for me, over the years, I've seen white people do it. But it was important that as a Black person, I went out there and I stood. And I was very interested when I realized that Jeremy is from Stopsley Baptist, because I'm developing quite a relationship with his senior pastor, Steve Moody. And we had a conversation about the Black Lives Matter motion. And I was sharing some experiences with him. And like Jeremy said, number one, you know, you can't turn off being Black. We don't walk away from the situation. And I was saying to Steve that an example is, you know, I'm born and bred right in this country. But when I go to the shop and, you know, I go into Tesco and the attendant says to me, would you like a receipt? In my head, I'm thinking, of course I want a receipt. I'm a Black man, because my experience tells me it's not about wanting a receipt because I may need to return the item. It's wanting a receipt in case I need to prove I purchased the item. Because as a Black man, my experience was you challenged about whether you actually purchased things, stopped many times for driving what the police called a nice car. That's a lived experience. I was speaking to Steve and I said, you know, there's certain things that I teach my sons. And he was saying, gosh, I never had to think about those things. And I said, well, my sons are young Black men, and young Black men are seen as threatening. So whether you're threatening or not, you're seen as threatening. So there are things that you have to think about. You know, when I was growing up, I had to think about, if I was walking on the road and ahead of me was a white woman, do I stay where I am or do I cross over because I don't want to appear threatening? And I think what happened with the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic was that we weren't distracted by life. We were there, we could see him being knelt on for 9 minutes plus, and it focused our attentions. The murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, it hasn't been the last murder, and it certainly wasn't the first. There have been many, many, many cases in the US. Some even more gruesome, people running away and being shot in the back and the police getting off. So I think the pandemic, because people were at home, there wasn't any other news apart from the pandemic. People actually saw what was happening. The injustice rose up before them, and the young people said, you know what, enough is enough. And I agreed with them.
Yeah, and I think that it was such in a graphic manner as well,
Mm.
and in broad daylight. And I think when he said that I can't breathe, that was, I think, a powerful, a powerful word that he came about, and showing that suffocation when actually we can't breathe in this pandemic as well, normally, and the planet can't breathe, and there's a whole thing around this I can't breathe at this moment. And I would want to turn to Jeremy. Now you're writing this book, the book is going to publish soon, which is racism and climate change. So why racism and climate change? Why was that important? And yes, why did you write this book?
Well, I became aware of climate change having grown up in Madagascar, so not very far from Mauritius, where you grew up. And so for me, as soon as I became aware of climate change, I realized that there was a justice question here, that all the emissions were coming from rich countries, and the people that suffer most are the poorest countries. And then as I began to look into this, I realized it's not just about rich and poor. There's also a huge racial dynamic here, which is almost never acknowledged anywhere, even in the environmental movement. And so I wanted to write about that. And I debated for a while whether this was my book to write or not. And my first instinct was, no, it should be a person of color that writes that. And then I realized that that would imply that racism is a problem of people of color to solve, and that I needed to take responsibility as a white person for that. And so I needed to write the book. But as you say, the issue of I can't breathe has resonance, because as a human being, the most natural thing in the world is to breathe in and out. I can't even stop myself from breathing in and out. And yet for someone to take the power of someone else to breathe, and to deny them that most basic right to life, was extraordinary. And yet climate change, the emissions from one part of the world falling on people in other parts of the world, or more locally, the environmental injustice of air pollution and traffic that is breathed by people of color in poorer parts of our cities. In London and in Birmingham, people of color are more exposed to air pollution than white people, who are more likely to live in the suburbs. And so this issue of breath is a live question of who gets to breathe clean air and who gets to breathe polluted air, whose lungs matter more. There's, like you say, the I can't breathe question spreads all through this stuff.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Very powerful. If I come to Rehana, this has also sparked a lot of public health debate recently about. We can see that the coronavirus has affected more Black and minority ethnic Asian people, and we can see that when we look at the number of deaths in Luton, is quite high. So, what do you have to say when it comes to this whole concept of racism, structural racism within the health system, if you can put it this way, or the way public health, are they addressing that adequately within public health?
I'm going to start really, I think, by just going back over a little bit about the passing of George Floyd, and those images. I've not watched that whole video, and I couldn't. I've watched about 10 seconds of it, and I'm uncomfortable with the multiple images of particularly young Black men being brutalized by the police, both at home and abroad. I have a problem actually sometimes when we conceptualize this as an American problem. At the end of last month, there were findings made against Bedfordshire police around the death of Leon Briggs and the police's role in that. But I think that particular video, those particular images of George Floyd gasping for breath, I think really resonated, because so many of us were, here in Luton, we know that we've had huge losses, and those have been predominantly in Black and brown communities. So we saw those images of George Floyd struggling to breathe, and we saw our loved ones, our friends, our families, our neighbours breathing their last breath, often alone. And that all came together. And I think that pain that we were feeling at that time really rose to the surface. In terms of what really has worried me since is that nobody has ever really wanted to take responsibility for racism. And that's why you get so much deflection around the issue, because if we say racism is real, we have to do something about it. We can't just nod away and accept unequal outcomes for different people. And it's that doing something about it that I think really scares people. What concerns me about public health responses to COVID, and particularly, I think I felt that reinforced yesterday when we saw the report from the government's Race Commission, is that the language moves to, rather than addressing racism, there is this sort of pseudo-scientific, good old-fashioned racial science being brought back into the mix again, that somehow we are racially deficient. There is something within our DNA that makes us different. Or the other one that we are very, very used to is that there is something about your culture. The way that you people live is putting you in danger. So, you might have acknowledgement that Pakistanis are more likely to live in overcrowded areas, and that is why you're at more risk, without any interrogation of why we are more likely to live in overcrowded areas. So those are the two things I think that really worry me about the way that the sort of the narrative, the discourse has been developing over COVID, and that includes within kind of public health authorities about COVID-19, is that we are reformulating the same old ideas. So even when we're dying, and even when we're dying in such disproportionate ways, 95% of the doctors who died, 95% were from minoritized backgrounds. And even in that position, nobody wants to take responsibility. Nobody wants to acknowledge what's going on here.
Thank you very much, Rehana. Pastor Vincent, so what's your view around this? Especially, perhaps the question for you, Pastor, is when we're talking about, Rehana just mentioned the concept of doing something about it. I know there's this concept of witness in our faith. And by witnessing very often, and when we witness what happened to George Floyd, we could visually witness what was happening, and people took action. And when you take action, is very often there's no more doubt, because you witness, there's no more doubt. And that's very much part of what faith brings us, to witness, and then you take action. But in terms of that taking action, I know you've been very much part of this group, the Interdenominational Commission on Racial Justice, with working within churches together and trying to bring people together. But very often trying to bring people together, it's not about this being cozy and nice and talking nice stuff to each other. It's about really addressing those injustices, and that can make people very uncomfortable. So how do you do that? How do you bring people together without actually, by actually navigating within that discomfort?
It's been a very interesting journey, actually. We were having meetings, churches together in Luton, particularly around the George Floyd murder. And it gave us, so there were 3 black pastors on the meeting, and we were commenting about our own experiences. And I remember I was the third to speak, and I just decided I was just going to be brutally honest about my experiences, not just in day-to-day living, but also within the church setting, within a Christian setting. And that sparked further conversations. We decided to look at it a bit further, but in between the 2 meetings, there was a suggestion that we make a statement. And it was at that point that we said, you know what, enough of the statements. We make statements and then we move on. We forget the issue. And we said, if we are going to be really change makers, we have to do more than make a statement. We have to look at this in more detail. We have to have some very uncomfortable conversations. And that led to one white pastor and I commend him so highly. But in a meeting, he said, you know what, when I reflect, I have to accept that I have been racist. I was brought up in a racist environment. I am doing all that I can to remove myself from that place. It was just such a brave moment. It was such a brave moment that people were stunned into silence and didn't know what to do next, because to hear somebody openly say, actually, yeah, that this is where I've come from. It was a turning point. And I think one of the challenges with change is that real change is painful. Because if you're going to bring real change, then it means that those in the ascendancy lose something. And those who have been in the descendancy gain something. But to gain something, those in the ascendancy have to lose it. And who wants to lose all the advantages and benefits and privileges that you had? So that's been part of this conversation. We want real change. And real change means actually you now have to talk about losing some of the stuff that you've had so that others can gain. I also want to just reflect on something Rehana was saying, because one of the conversations I had with my wife was, if you look at healthcare workers, the majority of them on the front line are Black and Asian. Rehana made reference to 95% of the doctors. And then you look at the nurses, many nurses are Black. And then many public transport workers are Black. So many of the people on the front line were Black, were Asian. And yes, they were dying. They were Black, they were Asian, and they were on the front line. So there's more than just a poverty aspect. There's the working environment where you will find Black and Asian people. Last year, I brought 2 sermons from Genesis chapter 10. It's not something you hear people preach on very often, Genesis chapter 10. But Genesis chapter 10 was talking about the ethnos of man, that we are all from the same family, all from Noah's family. We're all originated from there. Science backs that up. But we have constructed a term called race. And we talk about the Black race, the white race. And I've told the young people in my church that when I was at high school, we used to talk about the Negroid, the Caucasoid, the Asiatic, the Mongoloid. I said these were terms that were used, and we had an understanding that we were fundamentally different. Well, actually, science bears out what the Bible says. No, we are not fundamentally different. We're fundamentally the same. And so we do have to embrace this sense of community. We do have to support one another. As Jeremy said right at the beginning, this isn't just a Black issue for Black people to resolve. This is an issue for all of us to resolve. And there are so many factors. You look at public health, you look at health in general. I know that for many, many years, I don't know if it's still the case, but there was a feeling where Black people and Asian people never went beyond in terms of their profession. So you never saw them in the boardroom. You never saw them being the decision makers. I worked in Brent for a time, and I know that they used to bust consultants in from Henley-on-Thames and places like that, who had no concept of what it was to live in that type of environment, to make decisions for those people. All those sorts of things have to change.
Yeah, I think some very lots of food for thought there. And I remember when we had Professor Gush Gandawa from University of Bedfordshire. So when we were addressing the onset of this pandemic, and he said how government failed in terms of its policies, because the first thing was to do, what they did was actually protecting the middle or upper middle class.
Absolutely.
And when you look at actually what you should have done, and you look at actually how the guideline from a World Health Organization point of view, how you deal with pandemic, the first thing you do, actually you protect your frontline workers. And who are the frontline workers, as you just mentioned, Pastor Vincent, was your bus drivers, your taxi drivers, and they are all coming from minority ethnic background. Jeremy, if I come to you, so does that make you, I know you wrote this book, but you talk about that level of discomfort that comes. So how can we bring people together around this debate of racism? Because I think that when we talk about the pandemic, when people, it is affecting people's mental health. It is already creating more stress for people when we talk about racism. And that stress can be on both sides. Can be the white people that actually might feel like they might lose their white privilege, or whichever privilege that is, as Pastor Vincent mentioned, or feeling that, okay, these people are coming now are gaining something and we are losing something. So in this debate of us versus them, loss and gain, so how can we bring some sanity around that?
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting is that lots of people, mainly white people, have a very limited understanding of racism. And racism is defined as your personal prejudices. So it's very easy for people who haven't really engaged very much with the debate to go, well, I'm not racist. I've never said anything rude to, an Asian person at the corner shop or whatever, and therefore I'm not racist. But if you understand racism as structural, which is, of course, the lived experience of people of color, as soon as you see it as structural, it kind of diffuses that defensiveness, that white fragility, as some people say, because, and the virus is a perfect example. A virus doesn't have prejudices. It cannot have prejudices. So it opens up a space for us to talk about outcomes instead. Why were outcomes so much worse for Black and Asian people? Why do we have that statistic about the doctors? We know that the virus isn't prejudiced. So how can we unpack these structural reasons for these outcomes? It's the same with climate change. Obviously, climate change doesn't have prejudices. It's got to be in the structures. So how can we talk about the structures that cause these unequal outcomes? And I think it's a basic literacy question around what racism means, how racism is experienced, and how people of color understand racism and how white people understand racism. And those, I think, that basic literacy question can be really useful.
Thank you. And it sounds to me that there's a huge amount of education that needs to happen, whether that starts within our schools. There's already a big push saying that we need to teach the real history in our school. And you know what? We in Mauritius, we are taught about our history, and it doesn't make us bitter. Actually, it makes us, okay, this happened, how we can bring that unity and diversity all the time. And one of the subjects you have to take is history when you are at university, actually. Is very much part. I don't know how it is now, but that's how I grew up. But coming to Rehana, it can be a very lonely space very often. You've been at the forefront for quite a long time. I've known you, and being a woman first, and then being a woman of color, of Pakistani origin, and yet you are raising your voice around, and now you are actually even doing your MA in that field. So how can we then bring people together? I'm not saying that without discomfort. I think the discomfort will be there, as Pastor Vincent said. But how can we bring a certain harmony while we are addressing those issues?
It's been a very long, very long journey for me, whether it's, as you say, look, there are layers to my identity. I know the implications of the way that I'm racialized as a woman of South Asian heritage. I know how I'm racialized as a Muslim woman. I know how those parts of my identity come together for many people, and I know the impact of that. But I think I also have over the years really tried to understand the impact of those who are racialized differently. So part of the response to this, how we move on from this, how we develop conversation about this, is bringing those different experiences together. About how do we build a kind of a movement based on solidarity that recognizes the nuances and the differences, but also recognize that there's a shared experience there of marginalization. I think that's really important. And one of the things that I've been trying to do over the years is, you're right, it's absolutely lonely. I will go as far as say it has been brutal at times. It feels physically painful. When you are faced with the kind of emotional violence that you are when you talk about racism. And so that, again, coming back to Jeremy and community, that's really important. And we've built that along the way, you know. In Luton, we it might not be as extensive as I'd like, but we built that, and we're building that, and we continue to build it. And I think, you know, there have been events over the last year that really helped to facilitate that, and then when we carry on doing that.
Thank you very much. I think we are reaching nearly the end of our time. I think it's a fascinating subject. We can spend weeks, days, even years, like Rehana, studying in this whole field as well. It could take years to do that. I just want to end from a faith perspective, or from a spiritual perspective. From drawing from your faith background, so how would you draw in the lens of racism and resilience? What inspires you? Could be a chapter from your holy book, or a story from somebody who really motivates you. So how can you draw that strength and resilience to address that issue of racism? If I come to Jeremy.
I think there's all sorts of different things. And as a Christian, I always come back to the person of Jesus. And there's so many different things in Jesus' teachings where, you know, where he talks about love, and he talks about valuing other people more than ourselves. And but perhaps the biggest one from a context of privilege is that Jesus is the Son of God, and there's that passage in Isaiah where it talks about Jesus being in very nature God, and having all the power of God, and yet choosing humanity, and that aspect of being able to lay down power. As Vincent said, for there to be equality, power does have to be laid down by some people. And I think as a Christian, the ability to say, it's not about me, and I can lay down power, I can lay down privilege, and that doesn't make me any less to do that. If I can put aside things and not make it all about me all the time. I see that in Jesus. I see that in the way that in his very existence as a human being, in the way that he taught, and in the way that he reached out to people who his culture called untouchable, people you didn't speak to, the way he broke down barriers around women and around tribalism, and people who were diseased, people with leprosy, for example, where he would physically touch them when everyone else was keeping their distance. Jesus' whole life is about giving away power and about solidarity and breaking down differences. And so as a follower of Jesus, I want to follow in those footsteps.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. It sounds like giving power, sometimes giving the power of voice out to the voiceless, is very much a Christ way of living as well. But also, there's a whole mindset here when we talk about privilege. I think there's a mindset of scarcity where God is all about abundance as well. We forget that the vastness of God is so abundant that we believe so much in scarcity that we feel like something is being threatened if it's taken from us. So Rehana, from your faith tradition, what inspires you?
I'm going to tell a little bit of the story, or just kind of a bit of my journey in terms of being able to talk about racism within really difficult contexts. And often one of the things that we do as minoritized people, when we talk about racism, we talk about it in a way that protects white people. That's what we've done, because we don't want people to be affronted, because we've had that experience, that kind of the violence that comes with it, the rejection, the pushback that we come from it. We were always trying to frame our language in order to protect white people. And I had a bit of reading the Quran one day, and I came to that ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to stand for justice. And he says, stand for justice, even if it be, against yourself. So even when it's the most challenging, even if you'd have to speak against yourself and your own, and your own mistakes or where you've gone wrong, you must still stand for justice. It's like a direct command. Those words are really firm. And I thought, gosh, am I really standing for justice if I am prioritizing in this conversation the people with the most power? And I felt that day, I felt really ashamed. I felt a bit embarrassed. I thought, actually, who are the people I should be prioritizing in this conversation are those with the least power. And we see that in the example of many of our prophets, Jesus being one of them, but, you know, in the life of Prophet Muhammad, you know, standing up for those who didn't have power. So not to say that, you know, I have any more power than others, but that's what we prioritize in the way that we live our life and the way that we speak. So I think that was a bit of a moment for me, but it's been the moment that has kind of, you know, allowed me to push through that, you know, we are standing for justice. This is what God wants. We carry on doing it. We carry on doing it in a way that honors, protects, and centers those who are feeling the pain.
Thank you, Rehana. And while you're talking about studying for justice and referring to different prophets in different traditions, especially in the Judeo-Islamic Christian tradition, I remember last week one of our colleagues from the synagogue referred to when Moses went against pharaohs, and actually he was looking at resilience from that perspective because he had like a knot in his tongue. He couldn't speak properly. And he said, what a brilliant way of looking at resilience. Despite he was stuttering, he still went within that command with that level of faith and resilience to speak against pharaohs, which I think was a beautiful way at looking at resilience, addressing inequality, addressing justice. And if I come finally to Pastor Vincent, so I know you are a preacher, so from your point of view and from your faith tradition, what inspires you?
It's John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him, they shall have eternal life. And that's God loving the whole world, and whoever, black, white, Asian, wherever you come from, God has made provision for us. He has paid the price that we could not pay. He has set the standard that we could not reach. And he's provided the way out through his son, Jesus Christ. And when I look at the entire word of God, as I said, you know, I spoke about Genesis 10, but if you go back to the very early chapters of Genesis, I was thinking about the climate change. You know, God said he put man on the earth and said, have dominion, look after this earth, tend it, keep it. That was a command really about looking after not just the world, but each other, looking out for one another. In the story of Cain and Abel, you know, after Cain killed his brother, he asked the question, you know, am I my brother's keeper? Actually, yes, you are. So for all of us in this world and all of us on this line, God expects us to look out for one another, care for one another, tend to one another, treat one another with respect and with godly love. And for me, that's inspiring. It goes beyond color, it goes beyond ethnicity, it goes beyond culture, it goes beyond tradition. And for me, that's where we have to be. We have to be God-centered, not man-centered.
So thank you very much, guys. What we've heard today a lot about is color, community, care, compassion, climate change. So it's been a lot of, and it's all, the theme I think has been, there's a common thread is I can't breathe, and how can we, and you brought a breath of fresh air today in this debate. And I hope that this debate would be something that needs to continue in our town, in the country. And I think by talking about it makes life a bit more easier rather than trying to dodge the question, because that will help us to have a better future for generations to come. So on that note, I wish you all the best for the day, whatever you're going to do. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to meet you on another talk. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much.